Imagine a perfect world where you can build a restaurant, open the doors, and make loads of money. Unfortunately, those days are over. It takes great leadership, hard work, and long hours to operate a successful restaurant. Together, we can make it happen. This is Restauranttopia.
Welcome back to Restauranttopia. Today, we have one of the best-known real estate attorneys in Cleveland, Matt Yorkovich. We're going to hit some of the highlights on leases and some things that you should look out for. I'm sure Matt will say this, but the number one thing is to hire an attorney. But here's some things that you want to think about and want to bring up to your attorney who's helping you negotiate your lease when that comes up, and what to look for in a renewal. Matt, let's kind of hit the ground running. What you've dealt with hundreds and hundreds of leases over the years for commercial properties. What are some of the things that you're seeing with restaurant spaces and that owners and operators need to be aware of?
Great. Well, the first thing, thank you for having me here today. Anytime I talk to a client about starting a business or starting particularly a restaurant business, the first thing we like to talk about is their business plan. Mm-hmm. I think the numbers are pretty clear that a lot of restaurants fail, and they fail in the first year, and even a larger number of restaurants fail within the first 5 years. Mm-hmm. So the first thing to be successful is starting with a good, solid business plan, mm-hmm. understanding the type of revenue you anticipate that the business can bring in, mm-hmm. and then identifying a location that is suitable to that type of revenue.
That's a great point. Let's talk about that location, because you see this so often. There's a new restaurant in town, and they do a huge build out. It's a beautiful space. They're open for 6 months. They close down, and then operator number two, which I'm sure several of you have been in the situation, operator number two comes in and stays in that location for 10 years. Well, one reason that because of that, the build-out cost was so low for operator number two. Yeah. So what are some of the things you're seeing in leases that you got to be aware of before you sign?
Well, build-out costs are always an issue, and it's a hotly contested issue in both the lease negotiations and the terms of the lease. Mm-hmm. Because if the landlord's doing the build-out, or if the property is kind of what they call turnkey, mm-hmm. Then you're going to pay a little bit more for that lease space. Your monthly costs are going to be higher, or your cost per square foot are going to be higher. Whereas if the tenant is the one responsible for that build out and puts forward the capital for that build out, the tenant's going to want to make sure they're protecting themselves. The last thing you want to do is pay to build out a restaurant for somebody else down the line. And so it's important to just figure out, what you're capable of building out, what your financial abilities are, if you have that ability up front, or if you have to take out financing. And it also helps in determining what location is suitable. You might love a location based on where it is or what neighborhood it's in, mm-hmm. But if that property needs substantial build out, it needs licensing and permits, it needs approvals, it's in a location where you're gonna have to buy a liquor license from somebody else. Those are all sometimes unintended consequences and unintended costs that might not fit into your business plan. If you're anticipating a revenue of X, but then you have all of these out-of-pocket costs that the revenue of the business can't sustain, you need to get that capital from somewhere.
Yeah. And I think this is a great point that Matt's making, as far as some of those, that capital can come from a loan or from your investors, or it can come from the landlord what are they typically called?
Build out allowances.
Allowances, but if that allowance needs to be dissected as, what does that look like? Is it the landlord's tradesman who he's using, and maybe you're not getting a great deal? What work are they doing? Again, back to your point, what does the space look like? Is it a white box, or does it already have a kitchen? Does it already have a hood, or does it already have a freezer? One thing I wanted to ask you about, and I think a lot of our listeners need to better understand, is what's in the legal terms. In everything that we're talking about here is in Ohio, so we definitely encourage you to seek local counsel when you're dealing with these issues. But what is considered a fixture and what is not a fixture? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, well, I think the definition is something that's firmly affixed, mm-hmm. And there's also an issue of fixtures that are unique to that restaurant. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes the lease doesn't define that, and anytime that a lease doesn't define something, you're going to have to litigate to figure out what it means. Mm-hmm. For instance, an HVAC system, an air conditioner, it can be the difference of whether or not it's a fixture and it stays with the property, or it's the landlord's responsibility, or it's a tenant's responsibility, could be the difference of whether or not it's attached to the roof or whether or not it's attached, outside of the building. So they depend each time, and each lease could define those things in different ways. Especially with hoods, in a restaurant business, it's a very expensive piece of equipment. The refrigeration equipment is very expensive. It's where a lot of your costs are going to be, and if you're the one that's investing in those, you're the one that's paying for those. You want to make sure that in the lease, that when you leave, you get to take those with you.
Or get something out of them, the improvements that you made. So you really want to look at the lease terms, and think through it. If I leave, in 5 years and I find a better space, is that freezer coming with me? Is that, some of the other fixtures in the restaurant coming with you? That 3-compartment sink. What are those things that you installed or you paid for that are going to be left with the landlord, and he's going to be able to easily rent that again fairly quickly?
Yeah, sometimes it's counterintuitive. We recently did a lease where the restaurant owner was coming in to a space that was already built out. It had been previously a restaurant, and so they were acquiring a lot of furniture and fixtures and equipment. But it was old, it was outdated stuff, and they anticipated making some improvements, bringing in some new fixtures, some new equipment, upgrading the kitchen equipment over time, and was very, our client was very surprised to find that the lease provided that any new equipment, any replacements for the original equipment became the property of the landlord. Now we were able to negotiate that. It's always depends on how much leverage and negotiating bargaining power you have. But it was something that was not what you'd normally think. You'd think, well, I bought that stove. That stove is mine. I'm taking it with me. But the lease provided, the original lease, before it was negotiated, provided the opposite. So it's always really important to make sure that you understand what the lease says, because it sometimes is counterintuitive to what we would believe.
And that's a great point, as far as maybe this is a great time to talk about the difference in the different types of leases. One thing that you'll hear oftentimes from real estate agents or the landlord themselves is this is a triple net lease. Can you explain to our listeners what a triple net lease is, and how scary that word is? Like when I hear that, unless I own the property, I'm not too happy.
Yeah, the triple net lease is a great thing for a landlord. It sometimes can be very burdensome on a tenant. So the difference is a gross lease versus a triple net lease. And they call it a triple net lease because it puts the burden on taxes, insurance, like all of these unanticipated costs on the tenant. So really all the landlord's responsible for is collecting the rent.
I know that. I always say that whenever everyone asks, it's what is the landlord responsible in a triple net? Going to the bank and cashing your check.
Depositing those checks.
That's basically it.
And so, and if it's not a triple net lease, the triple net leases, even by definition, sometimes are a little bit different. Maybe they have insurance and taxes, and they break the outside costs down in what's called CAM charges, or common area maintenance charges. And sometimes the taxes and insurance are included in CAM charges. So
sometimes not. Sometimes it's just snow plowing. Sometimes it's the landscaping around the building. And again, not that you don't want those things to be nice, but you also want to make sure that you're not paying an overly burdensome amount. So your percentage of CAM can be determined by square foot or just by a flat fee. So those are all things you want to look at in the lease.
In terms of cost, if you're setting a budget and you believe that your rent is going to be $5,000 a month, well, your base rent is probably $5,000 a month. But when you add CAM charges or taxes or insurance or all those other unanticipated costs sometimes, maybe your actual outlay is $7,000 a month.
Yeah, month in, month out. If you have a slow February, that's still $7,000. One thing that I always think about when I think about triple net leases is the HVAC system, because that's what I see oftentimes. You have an entrepreneur, he opens up a restaurant, he's doing good, he's kind of hitting his stride, and then 2 years into it, 3 years into it, the HVAC system dies on him, and now he's responsible for, it's a commercial HVAC system. Could be $15,000, $20,000. that's a pretty hefty bill to have to bear. When you see that, how do you negotiate that when you see that in a lease that the tenant is actually responsible for that?
Well, the first thing we want to figure out is who is responsible for it, and sometimes the way you read the lease it can depend a lot. Sometimes it'll say that the tenant's responsible for routine repairs and maintenance, or just say tenant's responsible for repairs. But if the whole system needs to be replaced, then the landlord's responsible. Some just say the tenant's responsible for repairs, and a landlord will interpret that as, well, it can't be repaired, it has to be replaced, and because you're responsible for repairs, you have to pay to replace it. It's not very fair if you're in your fourth year of a 5-year term of a lease, or your first year of a 5-year term, your HVAC system goes down and you've got to put $20,000 down, and who knows if, an average life of an HVAC system could be 15 to 20 years. You're never going to use that whole life. And if you have to pay the full cost of replacing that HVAC, some other tenant down the road or the landlord's going to get the benefit of that. So you want to look really closely at those terms. And even, I've seen leases where you think you're covered, but then when you really analyze who's responsible and how they're responsible, you want an attorney to be making sure that you're protected there. Sometimes what we do is we say, that the tenant will be responsible for repairs, but then we'll cap the repair costs at no more than $500 per year. When you're trying to cap the tenant's repair costs, the landlord will typically require you to have a maintenance plan or a routine maintenance plan, so that you're having someone come and check it out regularly.
And there's nothing wrong with that, because you do want your HVAC system to be efficient, because you don't want your utility bills to be through the roof.
And you don't want to, if your HVAC system goes down, you don't want to spend 3 months fighting with the landlord about who's responsible for the cost. So some other things that we do there, like I said, we try to limit the out-of-pocket costs that we'll have. We'll also try to make sure that the landlord warrants that at the time that you take possession of the property, that the HVAC is in good working order.
Correct.
Because if you're responsible for replacement costs, for instance, based on your bargaining power, and you inherit an HVAC system that is on its last leg, well, then you better be budgeting for those replacement costs. And we talked about the build out or these large capital costs. If you're making a large investment into a landlord's property, you want to make sure you get a term of that lease with some options to extend the term of the lease, where you can take advantage of those improvements and you can kind of get a return on your initial investment. Because heaven forbid you put a couple $100,000 into a restaurant or into equipment.
I see it all the time.
And you have a 3-year lease. Well, at the end of that 3 years, you see very prominent restaurateurs and chefs that after their 5-year lease is up, they've got to find new space. Because why? Because the landlord thinks that they've got a gold mine.
And we know that it's oftentimes a good location makes a good restaurant, but
good chef.
It's the operator, it's the owner, it's the focus on prime cost. So that landlord having that disconnect, you want to take out these things that are foreseeable. You can see that you want to renew. Now you don't have to renew, but you want to have that option to renew at a certain price, and you want to also prevent any fights. I mean, that's what having a good contract to me is about. How do I move forward with this relationship? You own the property, I agree to pay you this rent, but if there is a dispute, what does it look like? And I've seen so many, and this is my career as an attorney, that I've seen so many times over the years that, all right, it's a gray area, it was poorly written or intentionally poorly written in the landlord's favor. Now, we can fight it out, but there's an attorney's fee provision in there where the tenant has signed up for compensating the other side's attorney's fee.
Well, and it's hard to operate a restaurant when you're in court fighting with the landlord. And
so true.
And you're spending time and effort and costs on things when you should be spending those on your business. It's a serious problem. And what I see so often is, someone's excited to start a business or start a new business. They read the lease themselves and they say, well, that all sounds fair. Right? That sounds great, and they say, well, don't worry, because I'm never gonna fail at this business. It's nothing bad's ever gonna happen. And so I don't need to worry about maybe some of these default provisions, or I don't need to worry about a personal guarantee because I'm never not gonna pay my rent. But you can't predict the future.
No, and you want to have a level playing field.
Yeah.
And so if things do go sideways for a little bit, or there's an issue, it could be no fault of your own. It could be an adjacent tenant that's hurting your business. It could be a water main break. There's all these things that are foreseeable. That what happens when the landlord, is unable to provide water to the building because the development is messed up. So what do those things look like, and how do we prevent that? So those interruptions. But if that does go south, you don't want to go to World War III. So how do you make sure that the lease is very clear and spelled out?
Yeah, and lease negotiation always has to do with leverage. And I think the biggest mistake that tenants make is they think that they don't have leverage. They think it's
I totally
a take it or leave it,
Or there's 10 other people in line to get this space.
Yeah.
There is not. I can guarantee you right now, as representing both sides, the landlord and the tenant, there's not always a lot of people. And even a good space, or a space where you believe it's a good space, but you maybe haven't looked at the numbers and the traffic counts and all the things that you look at when you're determining what a good space is. I'll give you 6 months free rent, or I'll give you 3 months free rent. Then they have all the leverage. So now you're in there, it's 6 months in, the build out may or may not be done, and now it's going south. One thing that I always look at, and I want to talk about the default, but I also want to talk about on the front end of the lease, when does rent start to pay?
Yeah.
So sometimes when you give free rent, they'll say, all right, you get 3 months free rent, and we're like, oh, perfect, we can turnkey this place and open up in 3 months. So you don't know about the health department, you don't know about an occupancy permit, you don't know if there's an issue with the city. This landlord or this building may have a horrible relationship with the city. So that 3 months may take a long time. So one thing that I've always wanted to put in there or try to negotiate for is we start paying rent not in 3 months, but when we get the occupancy.
Yeah, when you're open for business, when you can start generating revenue to pay that rent. Yeah, an interesting thing there is, as it relates to build out too, if the landlord says, I'll give you 3 months free rent, you think, boy, that's great, but the landlord's responsible for the build out. Well, what happens if the landlord drags his feet and doesn't build out the space for 6 months?
Yeah, or just can't get a permit, or can't, or uses a contractor. They got paper over the windows, and he's got his electrician buddy in there at night, and then the building inspector comes in and goes, hey, who did all this brand new electric work?
And it's called dead rent. This period of time where you can't run your business, but then you start having to pay rent. I don't know too many businesses without revenue that can start, paying those expenses right away and for any, length of time. If the build out is delayed and you need a liquor license, and the liquor license approval and licensing process requires the full building be completed, well,
it's tough.
It's tough. And so you want to really have those things ironed out up front. And, when we talk about people just believing that everything will work out, and, the landlord's not using an attorney, so I don't want to use an attorney because I don't want to scare them. I can assure you that the landlord at some point has used an attorney to put together a lease that's very favorable to him and is familiar with that lease and how it works.
The landlord is, not only has an attorney, whether or not he's using one for this transaction to save some money, maybe not, but at the end of the day, if he owns a commercial piece of property, he's very astute into the terms of the lease and has probably fought it out on several lease terms over the years on other tenants. So don't think that this guy is just coming to the table with his olive branch and going, oh, I can't wait for you to be successful. Because at the end of the day, his number one concern is getting paid. And he's not going to let you stand in the way of that. So I think one takeaway that I really want to impress upon everyone is that these lease terms are negotiable. There's no lease that's not negotiable. This isn't like when you go to the Key Bank or Huntington and you get a mortgage and you're like, well, I don't like paragraph number 3, and they're like, well, too bad. Like leases,
it's negotiable. And sometimes with a lease, depending on leverage, right? It depends on how much you can change a lease and how you can shift the tides. But sometimes the minimum that we need to do, and sometimes the best that we're able to do, is make a lease reasonable. Just fair. We're just trying to make it fair. I mean, if you're negotiating with someone and they're not willing to budge on certain deal breakers, as they would call them, they're certainly willing to give in on things that would make the lease more reasonable. Assignment provisions are often negotiated. They're hotly contested. And while the lease that you'll see, the first lease you'll see will say that the tenant shall not assign it without the prior written consent of the landlord, which may be for any and whatever reason, and depending on the temperature of the landlord, be denied.
Yeah.
And sometimes just getting that to be, okay, we're going to have to get written approval to assign it, but it shouldn't be unreasonably withheld.
No.
If we've got a tenant that can come in and replace us, and that tenant is just as bankable and just as qualified, well, then they shouldn't unreasonably permit the assignment. And I mean, the courts would hold that too, that it shouldn't be unreasonably, in good faith, they shouldn't deny it. The assignment. Sometimes just a business restructuring.
Yeah.
A landlord or a lease would construe a restructuring of your entity or changing of your entity to be an assignment. And it's a very common thing, along with getting it reasonably, not unreasonably withheld, is to say that, look, if I just change the membership interest of my company, if I add a new partner, if I
or add an LLC, maybe you got 2 restaurants under one LLC and you're trying to split it into 2 LLCs.
Yeah, then that is not. It should not be construed an assignment, or it should be a permitted assignment. Under the lease. And sometimes when we start these businesses, we think we'll never change our mind or our vision. But you never know what happens, and you might want to sell at some point.
Or just, I can think of a million different examples, but one of the members, say it's a 50-50 partnership or a 50-50 LLC, and your partner gets cancer, or you have an investment from a family member or somebody that put in a couple $100,000 into your restaurant. And that person wants out. They want paid back, or you're doing well and you want to pay them back. You want to own this 100% and execute on your dream alone. Now, there's nothing wrong with these types of things, but they do happen. And even if they're not on the table right now, they possibly could happen in the future.
And you need to protect against those. And like I said, we see leases that at the first draft, it's very landlord favorable, very one-sided, very burdensome. I've seen a lot of leases where my first advice to the client is, whatever you do, don't sign this lease.
Oh my God, I've been on the other side of the phone, and not too long ago, the attorney goes, "Well, you shouldn't have signed the lease if you didn't like it." And it's can you explain a little bit about that? So we hear all the time about unfair contractual terms in the consumer case, but what about in the commercial case?
Yeah, well, the courts have long held that. Commercial business owners are sophisticated. They're responsible for reading their own contracts. They're equally capable of negotiating their own contracts. And so, when those contracts go into court and have to be decided by a judge says, well, this is what the contract says. This is what you guys bargained for. And I'm not going to rewrite your contract because it's unfair. Courts will do that sometimes for a consumer who's being taken advantage of by a business. But the courts will not do that for 2 businesses, in a commercial setting. And so you're going to be held to the level of, well, you should have known what you signed. You should have read what you signed. You had a chance to get an attorney. You had a chance to negotiate terms that were more fair, more reasonable.
What about the scenario? And all true, absolutely true. What about the scenario where the landlord verbally tells me, "Oh, I know it says that, but you and I are good, so don't worry about that."
Yeah, well, it's very expensive to later prove to a judge in a he said, she said that there were verbal modifications to a written contract and have that be held in your favor.
And every lease is going to say, there are no verbal modifications.
Yeah, it must be modified in writing, signed by both parties. There's some situations where you can modify those, but the only time you're going to determine who's right or who's wrong in that situation is if it's litigated, and the time and money associated with that, it doesn't give you an opportunity to run a successful business. So, no, I would say, and in any situation, get that in writing and get it signed.
And get an attorney. I mean, if I want to impose upon, one thing out of this podcast today is, get an attorney. Attorney's not going to charge you $10,000 for this. You can get it done very reasonable. You should have an attorney that you go to for all your corporate documents and your employment handbooks and your other legal needs. You really want to build a relationship. You can comp them food. You can do different things as far as just a general source of cases. Restaurants are phenomenal. So, I think you can build a good relationship with the right attorney. You want to find an attorney that is proficient in this area and does a lot of leases, not the estate and wills attorney who looks at one commercial lease a year. You want to find someone that's a business attorney and that is very good in this area of the law.
Yeah, and on the cost thing, I would tell you two things are really good tips. First, I would get a letter of intent executed between you and the landlord before you even start with the lease. Because if you go to an attorney and you start with a location and a landlord and you're negotiating the lease back and forth and hours of time, and then the deal falls apart, well, you've got a lot of time invested in that.
So true.
Where if you can get a letter of intent that has terms that you're comfortable with, terms that you know that if I sign a lease that has these basic terms that are going to be critical for my business plan, you can take that letter of intent and shop it around to multiple landlords and find a landlord that right up front is going to say, look, these terms are acceptable to me. And then when you're actually negotiating the lease and drafting the lease, you've ironed out the biggest deal breakers for you.
I love that. I love this tip so much. This is a pro tip.
It's a cost saver.
Yeah. But it's also, it allows you to present to multiple people basic terms that you're acceptable with and that your business plan will accept. But two, it allows you to get to know quick. So if this landlord's not on board with this, you're not wasting a lot of time investing in him. And I see this all the time with some of my former clients and my friends. They fall in love with the space. Yeah. Now you got an architect reviewing it. But you don't even have a lease.
You got a lot of money invested.
So you got $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, and at the end of the day, they're all sunk costs. And you got to be able to have the chutzpah and the wherewithal to just walk away if it's a bad lease. Because signing up for 15 years or 10 years or however long the lease is going to be, that's something that you definitely don't want to do.
Yeah, you talk about finding out who you're about to be in business with too, because if in negotiating a 1 or a 2-page letter of intent that the other side is being unreasonable, how do you think it's going to be to negotiate a full lease with them? And then if you have a dispute, if the HVAC system goes down, if you have other problems, if there are other tenants that are causing problems, then how is that landlord going to treat you then? I mean, if they're treating you in a way that's oppressive at the time that you're trying to get into a relationship with them, when you're on the hook and you've got a personal guarantee for a 10-year lease, I don't think they're going to be any friendlier or any nicer or any more reasonable. So the letter of intent, it really gives you an opportunity for a low threshold, low cost, to get in there, start to determine whether or not this relationship will work, whether or not this property will work. The not falling in love with real estate is rule number one, because I've seen a lot of bad deals go down because someone had to have this property. It's the right property. If I don't get it now, then I'll never get it. Someone else is going to snap it up, and they end up rushing into a bad deal.
I see all the time.
And that's unfortunate. It's not necessary.
Yeah. So we kind of talked about the front end of the lease with the letter of intent. Not to go full circle here, but so let's talk about things go south. God forbid the restaurant closes. There's construction on the street that maybe interrupted your business. There was some issue beyond your control, or that your operation failed at this location. Personal guarantee.
Yeah.
So. Every lease has to have a personal guarantee, right?
No, it sure doesn't. I mean, a landlord will tell you that. Maybe even the landlord's attorney will tell you that. Most commercial loans.
And every lease that they have has a personal guarantee in it.
Yeah, they refuse to enter into a lease without a personal guarantee. Now, I will tell you, a personal guarantee, if I was a landlord, I would want the tenant to personally guarantee it too, because I want to make sure that I'm going to get paid a set amount of money over a set period of time. But the requirement for a personal guarantee really depends a lot on the tenant. It depends on the tenant's own financeability, bankability, credit worthiness. It depends on how much the landlord really wants that tenant in the space. A landlord, of course, would want one in every situation.
He's going to push for it.
He's going to push for it, and I would too if I was a landlord.
No, for sure.
But as a tenant, you want to find some ways to carve out that personal guarantee as best as possible. There's things like a personal guarantee burn-off, that if you maintain the lease, you're not in default with the lease for a period of time, that some of the personal guarantee can come off. You could cap the value of the personal guarantee at a certain amount. Say if it's a 5-year lease, you could cap the value of the personal guarantee at 2 years rental income, things like that. There's lots of different ways you can do that. Sometimes we avoid a personal guarantee by demonstrating to the landlord that we're creditworthy, demonstrating that we have revenue from other businesses, that we have other locations, that ultimately if they wanted to collect from us, that we would be collectible. Other ways is larger security deposit, or paying some rent in advance, paying first month's rent or last month's rent, or giving them 3 months of advance rent. And you can burn those things off too, that if you put a very large security deposit down first, that if you go through 3 years of the lease with no defaults, that 3 months of that can be turned into rent, so to provide you a cushion later on.
I've seen this area is, it's across the board as far as options. I've seen, especially when you do the build out. So say you put $200,000, you put $100,000 your own money into this space. The personal guarantee is unreasonable.
You've got all the risk at that point.
Yeah, you got all the risk. Typically where I see the landlord push back, and probably reasonably, is when the landlord gives an allowance or credit for the build out. So they want to make sure that they recapture that money, because it may not be a restaurant the second time around in that space. It may be a hair salon. So like your hood and walk-in cooler is probably not very valuable to the hair salon.
Yeah, and sometimes what you can do in that situation is, I always like to, when I'm representing the tenant, put options in there for the tenant to terminate the lease. Now you'd think, why would a landlord ever let you enter into a lease that you could just terminate? It's not as simple as just walk away without any penalties, but you can sometimes cap what your actual downside risk is in those.
A liquidated damages clause. So
yeah, it's similar to that, where you're saying that, look, after 3 years, if this isn't a profitable location, if the traffic's not great, then I get an option to terminate the lease, and I'll pay you a termination fee of maybe if it's 6 months rent, but you might be getting out of 2 years of rent if you get an option to terminate in there. Termination options are really important. Landlords really like to do leases that are based on your revenue in a restaurant situation, and if you're not meeting those revenue goals, then it's mutually beneficial both for you and the landlord to be able to terminate it if those revenue thresholds aren't met. And then what you do there is you just find a termination fee that is reasonable, something you can live with, that, look, if this doesn't go south, instead of being out $1 million, maybe I'm out 6 months rent, which is reasonable. In 6 months, the landlord should be able to find a new tenant in there, be able to change over the space. Tenants will always, or landlords will always want you to pay, if they had to pay a broker commission, usually you're paying back that broker commission and a couple months rent, kind of for your right to terminate and get out of the remaining term of the lease. And another issue on large upfront build-out costs, you said $200,000. You have $200,000 into a building, you really want to make sure that you have a long lease. But if you have say you have a 10-year lease then, well, then you could be on the hook for 9 years of rent if you default in the first year. So sometimes what's better is to get a more moderate initial term. So say you do a 5-year initial term, but give yourself some options to renew that term, so that on your terms you can say, this is a successful venture. This is a great location for me. I like working with this landlord.
And there's nothing to say that you can't have 3 or 4 or 5-year terms, renewal terms. So you just think of those things when you're negotiating this lease. One thing that made me think, and I smiled, because the automatic renewal. Can you talk about that? So you got the scenario I'll paint is you have a 10-year total life of the lease, but it's split up into 2 5-year chunks. So it's the first 5 years, then a 5-year renewal period. I'm 2 months away from the end of the 5 years. I'm going to go tell my landlord I don't want the property here, take it back. And what are you going to tell me if there's a
yeah? Well, and let's try to say, well, no, you forgot to tell me 6 months in advance.
Yes.
That you we're not going to renew, and so you've automatically renewed. So even though you want out now,
I'm on the hook for
another 5 years. Another 5 years.
That's not what I planned.
And landlords will want you to notice any renewal provisions, in as long in advance as possible for them. And one of the simplest things you can do is shorten that window. So, you might get a 190-day renewal notice requirement. And boy, that's a long time. Yeah. And not to mention, you have to track those things to be able to say, hey, this deadline's coming up. I need to decide whether or not I want to renew. I need to put them on notice. A simple thing you can do is shorten those notice provisions or those notice periods.
And that's one thing that your attorney can help you with too, is not just negotiating those things, but your attorney and you should have a calendar. These are the events that we need to be worried about. These are our contractual terms, and if you have that just on a sheet, behind your desk when you're punching orders or when you're putting in food orders, that you're cognitive of these dates, because at the end of the day, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, when you're focusing on what your specials are, whether there's a line cook on staff tonight, all the things that go to the day-to-day operation of your business, you're not really noticed that 3 years has gone by and I have to, renew this lease, or I don't want to renew this lease. So those are the things you want to think about and not be caught off guard. The courts are always going to focus on what the actual lease terms are. So,
it's what you agreed to.
It's what you agreed to, and it may not be in your favor. So make sure that you understand those lease terms and make sure you consult an attorney.
Yeah, one of the things we do for some of our clients that have multiple locations, it's hard enough to run one business, let alone 5 or 10. Or we've had a client that had 85 lease locations.
Oh, yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. Managing 85 leases is a lot, and knowing when the rent's due and who the rent's paid to and all of those things. We've been able to create a lease tracking spreadsheet so that each of their locations and the critical terms of each of those leases, the critical deadlines and timelines for each of those leases are kind of recognized in one document. That every time you enter into a new agreement, a new location, that gets plugged into the same document. I couldn't imagine running a business and keeping track of something that's 5 years from now, without there being a separate document. Sometimes people, they forget to dig up that 30-page lease that they did 5 years ago.
If they even have a copy of it.
If they even have a copy of it.
I see that way too often. And that's one thing I want to push as far as a good practice tip is to, a practical tip is to definitely go to your attorney. Find an attorney that you have a real relationship with, not that someone's going to overbill you or underbill you, that you can actually pay for their services and get real value from. But have your corporate book, your binder, and then all the leases and long-term contracts that they're dealing with, have them have that in one binder, and then have a spreadsheet of when those things come due and the dates that you need to be aware of, because those are the dates that can really hurt you, and they can take you out of your game plan and what you want to do for long-term for the success of your business.
Yeah, and the great thing about using an attorney for those kind of things is attorneys have ethical requirements for how long we keep documents of our clients. And I've had various clients, reach out and say, hey, do you have a copy of that, lease we did 5 years ago, or, things like that. And so if anything, just having someone else that's familiar with those documents and, maybe storing those documents for you that can look those things up. I mean, you're not, if you're running a business, being able to interpret your lease, a 35-page lease at the drop of a hat is maybe not your forte. But picking up the phone and calling your attorney, asking him to go over default provisions or termination provisions, or hey, the HVAC system's run amok. I can't remember what we have in this situation. I think it's really important.
Definitely. I've said this 3 or 4 times. Reach out to an attorney. There's other issues like signage, permitted use, and all sorts of different restrictions that a landlord may try to insert into a lease. Anything else you want to leave us?
Yeah, I would say the best thing that a good attorney can do for you is help you understand your lease, right? So when I'm negotiating a contract or drafting a contract for anybody, I think that putting a good contract together is very important, but also making sure that my client understands the contract and understands what they're responsible for is really critical. And if you're running a restaurant, you shouldn't also be required to be able to understand a lease without it being translated to you sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes landlords will put a 35-page lease and either A, committing it to memory, or B, being able to translate some of that language. It really requires an attorney.
Oh, I agree. Well, Matt, I appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
It's if you want to find out more about Yorkovich Debo law firm and all the great work that Matt is doing, there'll be a link on our webpage at restauranttopia.com. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you,
Have a
Brian.
great day.
Thank you for listening to Restauranttopia. The gratitude that we have for each and every one of you spending your precious time to listen to this podcast is immeasurable. Please make sure to tell a friend about this podcast. And also, if you have any feedback for us, visit us on restauranttopia.com and drop us a line. You can also subscribe on your favorite place to listen to podcasts. Thank you and have a great day.
Matt, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. We got back here with Matt Yorkovich. We just did an episode of Restauranttopia. Matt, I want to kind of help the viewers understand, how do they reach out to you and how do they find out more about Yorkovich Debo?
Sure. Well, we're a boutique law firm located in downtown Cleveland. Mm-hmm. You can go to our website at www.goydlaw.com, mm-hmm. and we're pretty known in this area, especially in the different neighborhoods in Cleveland. And you'll find that if you talk to any attorney or go to our website.
Okay, great. And your practice is focusing on all things business, so you do more than just leases, correct?
Yeah, I say that I focus my practice on real estate law, but our practice in general is anything from sophisticated commercial litigation. Mm-hmm. We represent a lot of developers, a lot of landowners with large portfolios, startup businesses. Which sometimes leads to litigation, a lot of transactional work. We've done a lot of development and tax credit work. And so anything generally business related, we like to help our clients with. And then as our small businesses grow, mm-hmm. they get into other areas of need, and we make sure that they're well taken care of there as well.
So as you know, a lot of our listeners are local independent restaurants. And so if someone needed help with, say, a franchise agreement, mm-hmm. that they were starting the franchise, obviously, or an operating agreement for their company or with their business partners or some funding, would you be able to help them with that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we do everything from startup formation to operating agreements. We've litigated partnership disputes and breakups. We've definitely done a lot of contract negotiation and drafting. We've done some startup finance, multiple Series A, B, C, D rounds. Mm-hmm. And so I would say anything that a business needs, we're generally capable of taking care of.
Thank you. I appreciate your time again today. And if you need a great attorney and a great law firm, check out Yorkovich Debo and talk with Matt Yorkovich. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.